Thank you so much, and a huge thank you to Oxford University Press for such a warm welcome and for having me today, and thank you to you for the gift of your time and your attention for the next hour. I'd like to talk to you about a number of things, but I will make an apology first. I'm a bit of a wanderer when I'm talking, so I hope you'll forgive me ambling about. Now, you'll notice that I position this talk as from EdTech to PedTech, this global shift and what we can learn from contemporary research. But I just want to root where that's come from slightly. My background, at my heart, I'm still a classroom teacher, but I have what might now be described as a kind of portfolio of roles. So most of my time is spent in schools and colleges and universities, really digging deep and understanding what's happening, what are our learners experiencing when they're utilising digital technologies. And that's in the form of research coaching, of impact studies. Alongside that, I work with a whole range of educational organisations looking at what that means at scale across different spaces. And I also wear an academic hat, so I'm a postgraduate lecturer and PhD supervisor and examiner. But the common thread that ties all of that together is, what is this relationship between pedagogy and digital? Now, a couple of years ago, well, just over a year ago, actually, I published this book, From EdTech to PedTech, Changing the Way That We Think About Digital Technology. And I just want to lean into that title for a moment. The book itself was the culmination of about 12 years of very immersed research. And you'll notice that the emphasis on changing the way that we think about digital technology, not how we use technology, how we think about digital technology. So this morning, I'm going to take us on a bit of a journey. We're going to start by just thinking about some of the research insights in the EdTech evidence space. I'm then going to share a bit of an introduction to this term, PedTech. What does it mean? What's it all about? Why is it any different? We'll then look at the impact of a PedTech approach, and then we'll share some of the implications around that before giving you two very simple next steps to take away from this morning. Now, in the book, there's a whole chapter that's a kind of huge aggregation, a synthesis of the literature of the EdTech evidence space. So if you want to see all the references and read it in full, that's the place to start. But I want to just give you a couple of thought provocations now, and they are these. Now, UNESCO released a report, I'm sure many of you have read this a couple of years ago, where they used this really interesting phrase. They said the right to education is now becoming autonomous, maybe synonymous with the right to meaningful connectivity. I find it fascinating, don't you, the emphasis on meaningful connectivity. What do we mean by meaningful? Next, if we look at some of the economic implications, last year over $5 trillion was spent in the EdTech space, and that's projected to continue growing. What's it being spent on, and why, and how? And what's influencing those decisions? Something we need to grapple with. We also find, certainly across the UK and increasingly internationally, most schools are working towards ubiquitous device provision. Now, that might mean one-to-one device access. It might simply mean on-demand access to technology at the point of need, which doesn't have to be one-to-one. Lots to explore in that space as well. And finally, in the UK, certainly, we're now finding, and I think this figure is probably higher than that this year, more than 85% of classroom teachers using different kinds of technology every single day in normal practice. And that could be for planning, resourcing, preparation, assessment. It could be in the moment of learning. It could be post-class assessments, all kinds of things it could mean. But there's more and more of this happening. So we see this kind of global trend around access to technology and the permeation of digital skills than we've ever seen before. But so what? What does this actually mean? Now, in the book, we look at this in detail, but I just think it's best summed up by this particular quote by a researcher, Kasanathan, who says, there's this kind of repetitive cycle in technology, isn't there? Where we go through like lots of hype, the latest thing, the latest app, the latest technology, latest project, really exciting thing, lots of investment, financially, energy, time, often goodwill. Then lots of kinds of integration and implementation projects, action plans, and then we see a kind of lack of educational outcomes. And that's kind of frustrating, isn't it? And he says that cycle keeps spinning only because each new technology reinitiates that same cycle all over again. Now, for us, we're concerned with the learning, the education, So there's a little bit of a challenge for us here, isn't there? Because it's the technology that's reinitiating the cycle, but it's the education that we care about. So there's a bit of a challenge to us there. And that's where the book title came from, this global shift that we are seeing from EdTech to PedTech, because historically we've seen this kind of very EdTech oriented mindset where we've been thinking about how can we use the technology, how can we use the digital to support our classrooms, to support our teaching and learning. Great place to start, but it keeps the pivot, the centre of gravity, if you like, on the tools, on the technology. And what we're seeing now is this shift when we look at impactful use of technology, to a PedTech mindset, pedagogy first, PedTech mindset. And in this space, we ask, what is our pedagogy? What is our education? What do we mean by learning? What do we mean by teaching? And then when we have clarity on that, how could digital tools be brought in to support, extend, or enhance that? A very subtle shift in the same landscape, the same picture, but it does make a great big difference on the impact on learners and learning. But it's really important, and I want to emphasise this, that this word PedTech is not a thing, it's not a noun, you can't hold it. It's not a product, it's not a tool, it's not a company, it's a mindset, it's a way of thinking. And that's really, really important as we start thinking about how technology can be brought into the work that we do. Now, I've got one bit of a disclaimer here. We use this phrase pedagogy first mindset or PedTech mindset, but actually the word pedagogy itself is a little bit problematic because when we go back to its origins, where that word comes from, it actually stems from a space where a family might employ somebody to take their child to a schooling experience. And if the child wasn't wanting to go or do what they needed to do, they might beat them with a stick. Now, is that the kind of learning? Is that the kind of teaching, of pedagogy, of education that we want? So it's perhaps a bit of an inadequate word, but it's the one we'll use for now. We often find, because of the evolution around this word, it becomes misused. And we often find that it's become kind of used in the place of teaching or teaching and learning. So I just want to explain next what I mean when I use the word pedagogy. And this kind of aggregates a whole load of literature and theory from lots of different spaces and theories in this space. So we're going to divide the word pedagogy up into 4 domains. They're the 4 boxes you can see around the edge of the screen. I'm just going to unpack each of those very briefly. So we have, first of all, views about the purpose of schooling or goals of education. So why do we seek to become educated? What's the point of education? Why are we in this space, in this sector? Why do we have the roles and the jobs that we do? Why do we think young people should enter an education system or go to school or be tutored? Why? What's the purpose? What do we want for them? What do they want? What do their families want? What do our leaders want? What is the point of schooling and education? And how do we know if we've achieved that? How does it become impactful? Where do we see the so what, the difference that makes? Is it in economics, employment? Is it in certifications and qualifications? Is it about being ready for the next phase of education? Is it about being amongst a community, about being accepted and within and being able to interrelate between different global communities? Like, what's the role of education, of schooling? So that's domain 1. The second domain about views on the role of teachers and teaching. Like, what does it actually mean to be a teacher or tutor? What is this thing that we call teaching? So I'll just give you a silly example. Someone said to me recently, we've got these great AI tutor bots that can do all of this tutoring and teaching so the teacher can step back. So can a teacher be an AI bot? Can teaching be carried out by a sequence of AI or digital powered tools? And you'll either think yes or no or maybe, but if AI can do those things, ask questions, give feedback, mark, assess, grade, give recommendations, give next steps, provide personalised resources. If AI can do that, what's the role of the teacher? What's the role of the human? Therefore, what does it mean to be a teacher? Really big question. I don't have any answers for these, by the way. But they're really big questions we need to engage with. The third domain, views about learners and learning. What does it mean to learn? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Right now, are any of us learning anything? All around the room, different people in different roles, different positions. Are any of us learning anything? Do we need to know if we're learning? Do we need to know if others are learning? Does it matter? Do others need to know if we're learning? Does that matter? How would we know? If we're learning, where's it happening? Is it happening in our fingers, our brains, our feet, our bodies? Is it happening on our notes? Like, where is this learning thing going on? What changes? What's different? How do we show if we've learned something? What does that look like? What does that feel like? Why would we want to show others we're learning? They're really, really big questions. And then the fourth domain, about views on knowledge and knowing. So what is knowledge? Where does it start? Where does it end? How do we know when knowledge changes? Do we know when knowledge changes? Are we aware of that? And over time, knowledge can be considered very, very differently. So once upon a time, a long time ago, lots and lots of people thought the earth was totally flat, right? That was knowledge, that was a fact. And now in 2025, slightly fewer people think that the earth is flat. So somewhere something changed, right? But why? Who decided that? Was there like a world vote that we all changed our opinion? Or is it that we looked to particular experts and thought, oh, they're saying it's different, so we'll think. And why do we listen to them? What gives them the validity for us to accept their thoughts? What changed? Why do we accept some views over others? Why do we believe some things more than others? And if you have knowledge, how do others know that you've got knowledge? Do you have knowledge you're not aware you've got? They're really big questions again, but all of these things, each of us, our beliefs about these things, permeate everything we do as educators, in the words that we choose, consciously or subconsciously, in the decisions we make, in the way that we conceptualize and think about things. It all makes a big, big difference. I'm going to give you a couple of very concrete examples with this. And I want you to think of these pyramids as 3 layers. So the top layer are the kind of surface level stuff we see, our pedagogical practices, our actions. So can you just give me a little wave if you use quiz tools in some way in your roles, or the students or colleagues you work with use quiz tools? Yeah, so quite a common thing to use. Now, when we talk about these quiz tools, when we talk about digital quiz tools, we often talk about the benefits, things like automated marking, you can reuse them, you can allocate them, really efficient for time saving, personalised pathways depending on your results, lots and lots of things there. Great, brilliant, fantastic. Right, that's the practice, pedagogical practice. Let's just unpack that a little bit and go a bit further down, and let's think what the strategies are that are underpinning that practice, the pedagogical approaches, I might call them. And these are things like retrieval practice. The more you test and check, the more you repeat something, the more you revisit something, the more likely you are to store that from short into long-term memory. And for a teacher, using those quiz insights, that formative assessment gives you the data that you need to then best enable the learner to move the next step forward, the appropriate step for them. So built on these teaching strategies. But underneath that, there are some deep pedagogical beliefs that we don't often think about. For example, those kinds of practices are built on the premise that learning is predefined. We know what we're going to learn before we've started to learn it. We know what the route is, that it's cumulative. You've got to learn that before you can learn that, before you can learn that. You've got that learning is sequential, that it's going to happen in probably a particular order, and that fundamentally learning is individual, happens in one person's head. So you could do that quiz sat in a cupboard on your own, or you could do that quiz in a room full of people. The pedagogy wouldn't be any different. So that's really important to think, what's underneath, what's underneath? What are the beliefs we hold that are embedding and permeating through the actions that we carry out? I'll just share with you one other example like this, which is, I would call it partial pedagogy, and you'll see why in a second. So we often, in meetings, in classrooms, in collaborative groups of learners, we often talk about collaboration and the importance of working together and collaborating. And one of the practices we often use are collaborative boards, ideas boards. Let's get our ideas all down on a shared space so we can all see them. Really, really popular. And it's something that's very easy to do with digital tools. So we see lots and lots of this in different educational settings. Well, let's just again unpack the practice and look at the teaching approach, the pedagogical approach underpinning this. That gives us visibility, that gives us a bank of ideas. It prevents kind of, what do they call it, blank paper syndrome? It gives us all of those things. But actually, the pedagogical value in this is that third layer down, isn't it? Because collaborating assumes that the value is in us interacting with each other's ideas. Otherwise, actually, what we're doing is just one giant run of parallel learning. The value is in going across ways, learning together. And how do we do that? By talking. It might be oral talking out loud. It might be commenting, written versions of talking, communicating. But it's the communicating across the ideas that gives the value add. The type of talk really, really matters. And if we've got collaborating lots of ideas on a page, but we're all doing that in parallel to each other, are we actually collaborating? So another practical example. Now, the reason I'm sharing all of this with you is this, because we can recognise that we've all got different beliefs that permeate, that embody who we are and what we do, the choices and decisions that we make. But each of you, each of us, are leading others and their learning, whether those are adults, peers, colleagues, families, communities, young people. We're leading the learning of others. And I think the wonderful Professor Mick Waters and the late Professor Sir Tim Brighouse summed it up quite nicely in their About Our Schools book, when they said this: there's this kind of lack of agreement about what schooling, about what education actually is. And they use this phrase, if we have no agreed purpose, and I'm not sure we'll ever get complete agreement in the purpose of schooling and education, but that's a whole nother session, then they say the whole enterprise is at the whim of the individual. Now, how significant is that for the leadership that each of us have? It's huge. Your individual, personal, pedagogical beliefs really, really matter. I'm going to give you a little activity now, just to kind of surface some thinking here. So, in any kind of learning activity, in a classroom, in a tutoring session, in a professional learning space, team meeting, any scenario where you're working with others, you're leading the learning of others, I'd like you to think about questions that you ask other people. And I'd like you to think then about the answers that those other people give. And then my challenge to you is this: what do we do with the answers? What do we do with the answers? Who benefits from the answers? Now, I'm going to give you 4 different examples. And then in a moment after that, I'm going to ask you, you don't have to share this, but I'm going to ask you which of those 4 examples is the thing that you tend to do most. Okay? So remember where on the screen the example is. Here's the first one. Who's benefiting from the answer? So benefit 1 is we ask the question, somebody answers, and the benefit is so that the person who asked the question can check if the learner is right or if they're wrong in order to assign a grade or an action to them. Okay, that's benefit 1. Benefit 2 is we ask the question, we hear the answer, and the benefit is so that a more knowledgeable other, which could be the person who asked the question or it could be someone else, a more knowledgeable other can identify learner misconceptions, things they don't quite understand, so that those can then be addressed and supported. It's coming back, a bit like a boomerang. Benefit number 3, we ask the question, we hear the answer, so that the more knowledgeable other, which again could be the educator, the person who asked the question, could be someone else, can facilitate further learner depth, facilitating further learner depth through challenge and further questioning. So rather than coming back, it's going out that way. And benefit 4, we ask the question, we hear the answer, and the benefit so that the group of people can collectively subvert, challenge the assumptions that are being made, therefore developing new forms of knowledge that didn't exist before or couldn't have been predicted before. So just have a think, which of those 4 Because we'll do all of these in different times, different places, but which of those is really, really where you see the benefit of answers? Here's the thing. Which of those need an educator, a professional, skilled, qualified educator? Which of those need a human being?
Number 2.
Really, really interesting to jump into, isn't it? Really, really interesting.
Number 2.
So, keep in mind which one you're thinking. The first one represents the behaviourist theory of pedagogy. The second one represents individual constructivism, so thinking like Piaget. Third one represents social constructivism, thinking zones of proximal development, Vygotsky, all those kinds of things. And the fourth one represents socio-cultural theory, Levin-Wenger, communities of practice, etc., etc. Loads more about it in the book. If you felt strongly drawn to one of those, and you'll probably find you struggle between a couple, but if you felt strongly drawn towards one of those, have a look at that theory of pedagogy. Dive into it, understand it, let it challenge you. Don't let it define you, you are you, but let it challenge you, let it challenge and stimulate your thinking. Now, I just want to share with you this graph because I do that kind of activity lots and lots and lots in different places with different groups of people. Broadly speaking, and bear in mind this is mostly UK specific, not all, but mostly UK specific, we tend to find the split roughly like this. I don't know if you can see the words from here. So we tend to find about this proportion benefit 1, behaviourism. This sort of chunk, that was benefit 2, individual constructivism. Benefit 3, social constructivism. And then the top one, socio-cultural theory. That's broadly, and that's thousands and thousands of educators represented there. That's the kind of rough trend. But the key thing is, we don't all agree about the purpose of questions, answers, schooling, teachers, learning, knowledge. We don't have widespread agreement. So we have to work with the idea that we all think slightly different things, even when we use the same words, like teacher, teaching, learner, learning, education. We're using the same vocabulary to mean different things. And one thing I just want to throw into the mix with this, if you think that's roughly the spread of pedagogical beliefs across the sector, if we segment that data to those who describe themselves as AI enthusiasts, look how that changes, right? Now, when you think of what I was saying about benefit 1 and benefit 2, and which need an educator, which need a human, that gets really interesting, doesn't it? About who's leading conversations about learning in an AI era. So, something to think about there. Now, the thing I want you to take away from that is actually very, very simple. There's, lots of kind of data and study behind that, but the message is far simpler. It's when we think about technologies, whether it's AI or whether it's digital more broadly, often we hear this mindset of, how can I use AI to help my productivity? How can I use these tools to help me with that? We put the tool first. How can I use the tool to do da-da-da? And what we want to do is shift that the other way around. Think from EdTech to PedTech, which is this. What value should we be prompting humans to add in a space where so many things can be automated? What's the human value add? That's where our energy really wants to go. Let's take the technology with us to help us free up the human. Let's look at the human value add. So from EdTech to PedTech. So with all of this in space, I now just want to lean into what the impact of this approach is for the sort of last part of this session. And I've conducted lots and lots and lots of different impact studies with different groups of schools, in different locations, different contexts, different places. And I want to share just a couple of key findings with you that I think will be relevant to the work that you do. And over coffee, I'd love to hear how these align with what you see and what you experience. Now, the studies or the findings I'm just about to share, just a few headlines from them, are from the studies over the last couple of years, and they're from 7 very large groups of schools. So they're typically what we would call a multi-academy trust. It might be 20, 30, 40 schools for each trust. So it's a large number of trusts. They span across state-funded and independent-funded education across all age ranges, and you can see the sorts of scales of data generation, interviews, observations there on the screen. What they share in common is that all of them have taken a pedagogy-first approach to the use of digital technology. They've all done so with a strategically, carefully chosen digital package. They all have one-to-one device provision, on-demand access, and they all have a mindset of pedagogy first at the heart of that. So some headline findings from that. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention is what that looks like in the classroom. And the classroom furniture and layout tend to vary quite significantly, but the key components are these. In these environments, if you see on screen, and you'll have these slides later if you want to look up close, you'll see that many of the students, as well as their device, they've got headphones, so they can hear, when they're reading something, they can hear it as well at the same time, for example. They've got microphones so that you can use talk to text and then spend their time editing rather than typing, things like that. You'll notice is fully blended resourcing. It's not all digital, it's not all paper. It's what do we need at the right point in time to support learning. You'll see that the children have got different things on their screens. Some are being stretched further, some are being supported, so everyone's moving along at their own trajectory. You'll see lots of accessibility features in there, and that might be screen contrast, magnification, overlays, all kinds of things. And you'll see that digital is there to support learning all the time, as and when it's needed, not for novelty, not just for computing, and not just for young people with additional or special educational needs. Really important distinction. So let's look at the impact. Oh, no, one other thing I nearly forgot. People always ask me about costs and savings and how do you fund all this. So just very briefly, in all of the schools that I've worked with, it typically works out at about 12 to 15 UK pounds per child per month for all the devices, all the infrastructure, all the training. And that sits across whichever ecosystem, whichever package, whichever device type you choose. It's broadly in that range. How's that funded from existing school budgets? It's funded by thinking differently about staple diet things like photocopying, exercise books, textbooks. You can actually reduce the costs of photocopying. In these schools, the average was about £78 per child per year, and a reduction in, not removal of, reduction in exercise books saves around about £160 per child per year. So it's cost neutral in terms of the provision. And if you think about the cost of that, it equates roughly to a weekly takeaway coffee, which when we see the impact on learning in a moment, you'll see why that makes me smile. So now let's look at the impact. People always ask about attainment. So this is a great place to start. In schools that have been working in this way, you'll see not only are they outperforming national averages, but the gap is growing. So the green bars are national averages for end of school, end of key phase attainment across reading, writing, maths. The orange bars are schools working in this way. So it's outperforming and growing, and that's consistent across the schools that are working in this way. The gap is growing incrementally because as young people learn the skills, become familiar ways of working, of course, the confidence, the fluidity, the knowledge, the understanding increases. We also find that the difference we see in attainment, the space it affects most, is a number of young people who are working at higher levels as a result. So what we would call beyond expected standards into greater depth learning, or the highest grades in terms of qualifications. And the children that make the biggest leap in progress are usually those from disadvantaged backgrounds because they've got access and support that they wouldn't otherwise have. There are also a number of other quick-fire findings that are helpful to be aware of. So we're finding that in-year progress is significantly more, often a year accelerated as a result. Interesting writing outcomes, which people always ask about when we think about digital, writing outcomes, increasing substantially and outperforming national averages. And as I said, our young people facing different kinds of disadvantage, whether that's care and support at home, poverty, all kinds of different things, are usually those that benefit the most. We also find because of a sort of digitally familiar way of working, teachers' workload is significantly reduced. And there's consequences in terms of all this, in terms of a schooling environment. Attendance tends to go up, behaviour issues tend to go down, children tend to move between schools and tutors much less, staff are much more satisfied as a result, which leads to greater staff retention. So some really, really powerful findings there. I want to lean in a little bit to think about young people with special educational needs or additional learning needs. And we're seeing across the UK gradual increase in the numbers of young people with additional needs in the classroom. But interestingly, in the schools that have been working in this fully digitally embedded way, we're seeing the opposite trend. It's not that the needs are not coming in, it's that they're being met differently, and therefore the cost and time required for additional support is going down. Really, really interesting in terms of equity. You'll notice the light blue lines across the bottom. Those are the very high level needs. Of course, that's going to be stable all the time. That will always require that additional support. I'll just give you some very practical examples, things you may wish to take away for your own practice, for example. So some of these things are really simple tools, like just using a screen reader so that young people can read a text on screen and hear it at the same time. And of course, they get the benefit of things like pronunciation, understanding new vocabulary, familiarity. They're also, you'll notice she's got the screen overlay, the yellow bar. So the cognitive load is much less. She's just looking at the text that she's focusing on, not being confused by all the other words on screen as well. In these studies, we found 42% of children were opting to use this. That was in a landscape where I think it was about 17% would have traditionally been kind of prescribed as using these tools. Children are opting to use them. And their reading attainment in that same cohort was way higher than the national average as a result of this. So it's not just for children who need it, it becomes a useful way of working for a significant number of young people. Similarly to that, if we just stick with that thing about understanding new vocabulary, picture dictionaries, audio dictionaries, really, really interesting challenge in a classroom. So how often young people come across words that they don't know, and what do they do to find out the meaning of that word? They have to read more in a dictionary. They have to grapple with more text in order to understand that first word. So the use of audio dictionaries or picture, visual dictionaries have been significantly beneficial for these young people. And when we look at the number of people who are choosing to use this, more than 3/4 of children were opting to use these ways of understanding new vocabulary. Now, it had a massive impact on quality of writing because it's so quick to understand new words, understand new phrases. What happens then? You get a greater range of vocabulary, become used, become familiar. That goes into writing, and then greater depth, so higher level writing attainment, more than triple the national average. So massive impact on writing outcomes, on fluency, fluidity in writing, all of those things. And now those examples I gave you from our primary educators, there's also really, really simple things like just going from handwritten work to typing work. At scale, we found it made the difference of 2 grades, just handwritten to typed work. And why was that? Because the speed, the fluidity of doing that freed up cognitive load so that the focus was on quality of content, not the recording and the production. So the thinking's in the right space, it's thinking about content. So huge implications there. And also very, very simple things like we talk about real life experiences for young people so they can then use those experiences to develop their reading, their writing, their talking, their thinking. But of course you go outside, in this example, put up a tent, real life experience, you go back inside to do some writing or thinking, instructions, whatever it might be, completely forgotten what we've just done. But if it's captured on video, you can rewind, repeat, rewind, repeat. It's the same with teacher instruction. If at the end of a session, the child's thinking, oh, I was listening, but now I've forgotten what to do. If the teacher's been videoed, the learner can go back, watch the teacher. And when we watch carefully what they do, they don't go back and watch the whole thing. They go back and watch little bits. And the implications on their metacognition, their understanding about what they need to revisit are quite fascinating. Now, the key thing across all of this is that these tools are in most devices. They're there. They don't necessarily mean buying new stuff. A lot of these things are just there and available. They're in mobile phones, they're in laptops, they're in tablets. They're accessible to learners. And learners recognise that and often say, why are we being prevented from using what we have access to? Which is an interesting challenge. And that's why this thing is really important about technology not being just for those who need it, not being just for those with special educational needs. Yes, it's massively important and impactful for those young people, massively important. But it's also all those young people who could be doing so much more if they were given the opportunity to do so. So that sense that this is for everybody, this gives people dignity is really, really important. And I mentioned earlier about the implications on writing, massive, massive implications there. So one very quick thing before I just wrap up. One of the things that makes me kind of giggle a little bit is how many classrooms I go into in schools where teachers talk about the students having poor working memory or forgetting what they're doing, things like that. And I say to him, have you got a board at the front of the class? And we have this strange conversation about, there's this thing up here that can help with working memory. And I'm sure many, many of you do these kinds of things already. And we have this conversation of, well, if students are struggling with their working memory, do we use front of class display boards? Do any of your learners watch things like YouTube at home where they have the subtitles on? What about using subtitles at the point of learning in the classroom? And it tends to be that penny drop moment of, oh, I'd never thought of that. And I wonder how many classes, how many learning environments we could just pop the subtitles on, either in English or another language. You could have each student with their own device hearing or watching or reading subtitles in whatever language is familiar to them. It doesn't have to be the language that the person is speaking. It's a very simple thing to use. It's in the software we have on our devices. It's there all the time. The key message I want to share with you about it, though, is learner perception. Because we have, and I know we'll hear from experts greater than me on this, the current generation of learners we're working with, they're used to seeing subtitles on YouTube, on TikTok. That's normal. They think we're trying to make learning harder for them by switching them off in our classrooms. That's not the way I would have thought of it. I would have thought it was an opt-in. Students think we're creating a barrier. Something to think about. So just to wrap up then, my core message is this, and it's about this phrase, pedagogical alignment. And it's that if we really get to know what our pedagogical beliefs are, those 4 boxes, those big questions that I don't have any answers to, if we really think deeply about that, really deeply, and it might take weeks, months, years, keep thinking about it over and over again. If we understand how we think learning can be structurally supported, then we're really well lined up to think really clearly about our intentions, our vision, our value, our ethos, our policies for making that start to come to life. And if we have clarity on that from a pedagogical grounding, we're then able to choose and use the most appropriate evidence-informed strategies to actually make that happen, our teaching and learning strategies, our operational strategies. And of course, if we have alignment across those things, our actions really are then living out our deep beliefs about how best to support learning. And what does that do? The most important thing of all, it means that our young people experience and then internalise the things we want them to experience, internalise, not just the things we happen to do because that's how we've always done it or that's what's normal in this space. What we really want them to experience and internalise. And in terms of digital technology, whatever it is, devices, AI, whatever it might be, if each of us have clarity on what kind of human being, what kind of educator we want to be, what kind of leader we want to be, if each of us have clarity on that and we choose the tools that help us to support, extend or enhance that, then both the tool and the human become more impactful. Value for money, value for time, value for human beings. So 2 very practical next steps. If you've got a smartphone, do zap that QR code. It will take you to a resource that will help you start to unpack your pedagogical beliefs. It's entirely optional to take away with you after this session. Just start you on the journey to unpacking those pedagogical beliefs. And once you've had time to think about those, if you would like to, in the book, in chapter 7, it then starts signposting you towards tools that might help you to support, extend or enhance your pedagogical beliefs. And my closing point is this one, and I want you to take this and think really carefully about it, because we hear worldwide about the digital divide, don't we? Connectivity, infrastructure, devices, training, all of these big, big operational issues. They're still there, they're still challenging for all of us. But actually, it's not just about that anymore, is it? The digital divide is also now caused by the choices that each of us individually do and don't make in our everyday practice. So a huge thank you for the gift of your time and your attention. I hope that was useful, and I'm going to pass back to Naomi. Thank you very much.